Welcome to the Environmental Justice Lab. I'm your host, Dr. Leslie Joseph, and I am glad that you're here because we are still talking about these principles of environmental justice, and we are at number 4. Number 4 in our list. There's 17. We're at number 4 right now. This is what number 4 says. Environmental justice calls for universal protection from nuclear testing, extraction, production, and disposal of toxic, hazardous waste and poisons, and nuclear testing that threaten the fundamental right to clean air, land, water, and food. So number 4 is very specific. It's probably the most specific you'll get out of these principles. And it says directly that we need universal protection from nuclear testing, extraction and production, and disposal of the wastes that come from testing and anything else associated with that would harm the environment. Now, when I read this, I wasn't sure what to make of it because I was thinking, why would you single out this particular activity in this list of what I thought would be broad, kind of sweeping principles for environmental justice? Why single out nuclear testing specifically? I mean, we don't do much of it now, I don't think. And I wonder why it was so important to say it so explicitly in this principle. Well, you have to do your research and go back in history to understand why it was so important that this principle singled out nuclear testing as something that we need to be protected from, right? We have to go back in history to think about why they would choose nuclear testing to single out in their principles. And so if you go back to the 1940s, 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, there was a lot of nuclear weapons development, a lot of research and testing and development of nuclear capabilities across the world, but specifically in the United States. And so when this was happening, there was a complete disregard for the impacts of that testing, of that production, of those nuclear weapons capabilities, right? They would develop the bomb. They would go out, drop the bomb, test it, see how destructive it was, and prepare it for use in war. And what these advocates are trying to alert us to was the reality that the testing, the disposal of the waste, all the things that go into that whole activity was being done in marginalized communities or in locations where people were being neglected and where those resources were being destroyed or contaminated with the testing materials. And so if you look at a map of where these tests took place, the vast majority taken in Nevada, New Mexico, and there's some in Mississippi. And all of these tests were being done in places where there were people who the government didn't really care much about. Let's just be honest about it, right? Out in Nevada, out in New Mexico, these lands, these areas where they were doing this testing, that's where the majority of the indigenous populations in our country resided at the time. And that's where they set up their institutions, their neighborhoods, their communities, and that's where they were living. And the government decided that's going to be the place where we do our nuclear testing, where we drop these bombs, and where we store this waste. And so from the 50s until the 90s, extensive nuclear testing in these areas. And so the people who drafted these principles, they did it at a summit in 1991. Let's not forget, the National Peoples of Color Environmental Justice Summit was in 1991 at the tail end of all of this nuclear testing. And it was viewed, I think correctly, as an existential threat to the people who lived in those areas. We can't have the government dropping literally nuclear bombs in these communities. We can't have the U.S. government sending all the nuclear, radioactive, toxic waste to these communities. That's what they were doing, right? There was a proposal, I think it began in the 70s and 80s, and they've been still trying to revive it. This idea that we're going to have this single place where we take all of the nuclear waste and store it underground. It was a place called Yucca Mountain in Nevada. And the indigenous populations rightly protested vehemently against this proposal. We don't want you sending all the nuclear waste from all over the country to this one location. Now, the people who proposed it believed that it was better to have all the waste in one central location than to have it distributed all across the country, right? Because you have nuclear facilities all over the U.S., these national laboratories, these federal Department of Energy sites that produce and enrich and provide nuclear energy and power and weapons are all across the country. And so to store them at those facilities, in their minds, would be less helpful than having one central location to send it all to. And people were not pleased with that idea. I'm not pleased with that idea. And if that ever comes back up again, I will be protesting against it because it is the wrong way to deal with this. And this principle is very clear that we have to have a situation where anything nuclear related is done in a way that allows for universal protection from every aspect of testing for everyone's environment to be clean and safe, right? So the air needs to be clean, the water, everything needs to be protected from these nuclear activities. Now, we're not doing so much anymore in terms of nuclear testing and nuclear production, although we are ramping up in some places. I used to work at a facility where they were developing nuclear weapons grade capabilities. I'm not there anymore, but that's happening. And when they do whatever they're doing there, it needs to be done in ways that protect the people and their environments. But let's just take a step back for a second and look at the broader application of the principle, right? So it focuses on nuclear testing. It focuses on universal protection, but we can apply that logic, that principle to any activity that's harmful or polluting. It doesn't have to be just simply nuclear testing. Obviously, it includes things like energy production. It includes things like data centers, generative AI facilities that are taking up so much of our resources and producing so much pollution to run and operate. Any large-scale operation needs to operate with this principle in mind, that you provide a universal protection and shield the people from any harm from that industry, from that activity, right? So listen to it. And you can replace the words nuclear testing with any other kind of activity that is harmful, right? So if I said environmental justice calls for universal protection from insert industry, this says nuclear testing, extraction, and production. You could say energy production. You could say data centers. You could say mining. You could say metal plating, steel production, cars, anything, housing. It doesn't matter what we're doing, because the idea is that we should all be protected from the harms associated with those activities. It doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter who's doing it. We need to be protected from it. And in 1991, the biggest, most harmful, most polluting, most dangerous activity was this nuclear testing, right? They did testing from, I think it was 1945 up to 1992, over 1,000 nuclear tests, which is destructive. It produces waste. It creates toxic environments. And this principle is saying we need to be protected from all of that. We need to be shielded from the harm that comes from that very specific type of activity. And so if you're Indigenous, a Native American living in these areas, you're probably still dealing with the fallout from that nuclear testing. I saw a map where there was some testing done in Mississippi, Hattiesburg, Mississippi. I imagine that there's still some residual pollution, some residual contamination from those tests. I know where I used to work at that federal facility, there was radioactive material all over the site. They had contractors and million-dollar contracts just to clean it up from the 80s when they used to make nuclear weapons during the Cold War. That's how toxic and how destructive this nuclear enterprise has been and continues to be. We still haven't cleaned it up yet. We still haven't managed it properly. We still haven't dealt with it. There was a story a couple of years ago where I think the New York Times saw in South Carolina, at that facility where I used to work, the fish in the local rivers had elevated radioactive levels. They call them radioactive fish, just swimming in the river because the impact is still there. The fallout is still there. We still need protection from this industry, from these activities that took place decades ago. We're still feeling and seeing and experiencing the impact of that activity. And this principle number 4, tells us that we should have universal protection from it. Every person, everywhere, should be protected from this activity, nuclear testing. And let's go even further, because obviously nuclear testing happened in very specific locations. And back when this was written, the EJ activists, the EJ advocates, the EJ researchers, the scholars, they believed that we had to shine a light on nuclear testing specifically to bring it to the attention of the people who were involved, who were overseeing it, who were managing it, to let them know that this enterprise was very destructive, very polluting, and we demand protection from it. And now it's 2026. What do we have? We have destructive mining practices all around the world. What do we have? We have fossil fuel production that's contaminating waterways, contaminating the air around it, producing waste that we don't know what to do with. We have no place to put, and it's finding its way into the environment. What do we have? We have war and conflict, bombing, destruction, mayhem all across the world, producing environments that are uninhabitable. What else do we have? We have data centers popping up all over the country, at least in the United States, sucking up all the water, producing harmful waste, creating an environment that people can't sustain themselves in. People are protesting against these enterprises, these activities. And so when I think about this particular principle, I imagine a world where no matter what we're doing, no matter what we're involved in, it's being done in a way that protects us from those negative impacts, that protects us from those harms that come from those industries, that come from those activities, that come from those facilities. That's what we're talking about. That's what this principle is specifically targeting. So it's not just we want things to be cleaned up after they're polluted and contaminated. It's whatever you're getting yourself into, it needs to be done in a way that doesn't harm, that doesn't contaminate, that doesn't pollute. That's what this principle is designed to produce. And to the extent that it produces that, we are operating in a just and equitable manner. In ways that it doesn't, we need to change. We need to shift. We need to make sure that we're doing things differently. Because it's not enough to just check off boxes on your permit, to check off compliance requirements when people who are exposed to your activities are experiencing harm. There has to be a willingness and an awareness to ensure that we are all protected from whatever it is that you're doing, whatever it is that you think is needed to enhance the quality of our society, of our livelihoods. Whatever that is, it shouldn't be done in a way that harms that hurts people, that hurts the planet, and that creates an uninhabitable, toxic environment. That's what we need to do. And I don't want to hear about how much it would cost to do that. Because guess what? A human life is worth a lot more than whatever it will cost you to protect us from your pollution. Sick people, a sick environment is very costly, and somebody's going to pay it. And instead of it being the people who are suffering, it needs to be the people who are polluting to ensure that that suffering does not come, because you've done all that you can to protect us from it. And if you can't, because you think it costs too much, then don't come around. We'll do better without your activity. This might be controversial, but I would argue that we're better off without nuclear weapons. I'm just saying, we don't need nuclear weapons. And so if the cost of having nuclear weapons was to disintegrate and to sacrifice large portions of the country, large portions of the world to produce them, then we shouldn't have embarked on that particular activity. We shouldn't. I know we're trying to position ourselves in ways that will protect us from any kind of foreign conflicts or incursions. But look, we're better off without nuclear weapons. And I know it's not just us testing and producing them. I know they're doing it out in Russia. I know they're doing it in China. I know they're doing it, in Pakistan and India, and all these nuclear countries are trying to build up their arsenals. They're trying to create bigger and more destructive weapons and more precise, targeted nuclear capabilities. But all that testing, all of that research, all of that waste is harming the environment, harming people directly. And so if we took this principle universally, globally, we would be calling on the same things from those countries as well. We would say, listen, this nuclear testing, this production, the disposal of this waste, it needs to be done in ways that do not harm and do not contaminate our environment. Well, we can't do that. Well, then don't do the testing or figure out something, because we're not going to sacrifice people and our planet so you can have a bigger, better bomb. We shouldn't do that. That's not a good trade-off. That is not an exchange that I think is healthy or beneficial for anyone. And so that's principle number 4. I'm going to read it one more time, just so we can hear it and feel it. Environmental justice calls for universal protection from nuclear testing, extraction, production, and disposal of toxic, hazardous wastes and poisons, and nuclear testing that threaten the fundamental right to clean air, land, water, and food. So listen to me very carefully. That nuclear testing phrase can be replaced with any other polluting industry. And this principle still holds, because the second part of the principle is the most important part, which is that we have, as people, as a society, a fundamental right. It's not a privilege, a right to clean air, land, water, and food. That is a right. And to deny that right to anyone because you want to do any kind of testing, any kind of production, any kind of activity is fundamentally wrong and needs to be confronted and addressed directly. There is no instance where anybody, anywhere, for any reason, should be denied these fundamental rights. The right to clean air, clean water, food, and land. And whatever anyone is doing, it cannot be done in a way that violates those rights. It can't be done. It should not be allowed. And if there's an instance where it's occurring, we need to speak up, speak out, and speak often about it. Because these rights are fundamental and they're universal. They're not just for people who live in the Western Hemisphere or for people who have democratic processes in their countries. It's for every single person anywhere. We need to be consistent and clear about that. Everyone, everywhere. We all have the fundamental right to clean air, clean water, food, and land, and environmental justice calls for universal protection to protect those rights. And those rights cannot be denied for any reason because they're fundamental and they're universal. And with that, I want to thank you for listening to this episode of the Environmental Justice Lab, where we are for the people and the planet. We'll see you next time.